Australia. If I can introduce myself, my name is Simon Elliott. I'm the Assistant Director looking after Curatorial and Educational Services. We are very pleased to welcome Glenn tonight as he addresses his topic of Towards the Participatory Museum, Rethinking the Museum of Modern Art for the 21st Century. If you could please make Glenn welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon, for that very nice introduction, and I'm thrilled and honored to be here on the 30th anniversary of the series, but even more importantly, at such an important time when we remember a Prime Minister that those of us who have presidents that wouldn't know a work of art if they stumbled across it are deeply envious of. I'm also grateful for the incredible hospitality you've shown me today and for a remarkable tour of this museum's great holdings and collections. And Simon gave me a deeply needed primer in Aboriginal art that I'll never forget and for which I'm deeply grateful. And all I can say is you have a spectacular museum with not only beautiful collection, but a very thoughtful display of that collection. That's part of what I want to talk about tonight, which is some of the larger issues that we at the Museum of Modern Art are facing as we think about the future. But I want to try and frame those issues in a broader context, a context that I hope would be meaningful for any museum. And as I was thinking about this notion of a participatory museum, which I'll come to in a moment, I was really reflecting on what does it mean to look at and consume, and I don't mean consume financially, I mean consume emotionally and intellectually, art today. And you know, a generation ago, certainly when I was in graduate school, and even after that, if you wanted to look at art, the place you went to look at art was a museum. It was natural. But that, I think, has changed rather dramatically, and now here I have to find the magic pointer. Today, when you want to look at art, you go to many different places like biennials, Sydney Biennial or the Sao Paulo Biennial or, of course, you know, the Venice Biennial. You go to these extraordinary places that produce remarkable exhibitions every 2 years, and now they're all over the world. Or you go to these art fairs, and this is Frieze, which has a fall showing in London or a spring showing in New York. And these, of course, are commercial art fairs where you can buy the art, but most of the people who go to these fairs aren't there to buy, they're there to look, to consume, to see, to think, to enjoy works of art. Festivals like Burning Man that takes place every year in the middle of the desert in Nevada, where literally tens of thousands of people come together to think about art, to look at performances, and ultimately to burn this effigy at the conclusion of the festival. I'm not too sure what kind of substances they consume while they're doing that, but they seem to have a really good time. Or mega galleries, like David Zwirner above or Larry Gagosian below. These galleries that now have branches all over the world have not only scaled up, they're often 10, 20, 30,000 square feet, but they are producing exhibitions with works of art that you might otherwise see in the most important museums in the world. Above at David Zwirner, a beautiful exhibition that took place recently of the great American sculptor Richard Serra, and below one of the many exhibitions that Larry Gagosian has devoted to the work of Picasso. And these exhibitions include and often are dominated by works of art that aren't even for sale. They come from major private collections or even from museums. Or artists like Doug Aiken, who created a rolling museum. He literally got a group of friends together. They rented a train. They started on the East Coast. They took the train across the country, stopping at small little towns and large places, and created performances and discussions about art. They took, if you wish, the museum out of the museum and put it across the country. And of course, today, many people consume art just by going to the internet and looking at exhibitions that are online. So the question, it seems to me, is with all these new and different ways of looking at and consuming art, why do we need museums? What are the reasons that we spend time in places like this great institution? And it seems to me that there are at least 3, and maybe many more reasons, why museums, art museums, are essential. The first has to do with the fact that they create a unique kind of space. I'll come to that in a moment. The second is each institution tells a unique history through its very specific collections. And the third is that museums are about the creation of stories, the narration of ideas that evolve, of course, over time. So the space of the museum is at the very least fundamentally social. That is, most art museums, every art museum, I think, in fact, is a place that people come to be not only with art, but with other people. At the Museum of Modern Art, I was staggered to learn that 85% of our audience comes to the museum with someone else, a parent, a friend, a spouse, doesn't matter. Coming to the museum is not a solitary experience, it is in fact a social experience. But that social experience is about engaging with culture. And here is a work by Martha Rosler, an American artist, called The Great Garage Sale. And garage sales in the United States are kind of tag sales. You know, people bring all the old stuff that they have that they don't want anymore, and they sell it for very little money to anyone who will buy it. Well, she collected thousands of objects from people who worked at the museum, but anyone else who wanted to drop it off, and then established this exchange within the museum. And what she was getting at was that we consume by transacting. And in that process, we create ideas and culture. So museums are social spaces, but they're also cultural spaces. And of course, they're fundamentally intellectual spaces. They are places we come to because we're interested in the ideas that are embedded and embodied in the works of art that are there. So in the case of the Museum of Modern Art, the foundational idea grew out of 3 remarkable women, including Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, who got together in the 1920s and wanted to create an institution devoted to what today we would call contemporary art, but what they called modern art, that is the art of their time. And they hired a young scholar named Alfred Barr, who actually was trained as a medievalist, but had become very interested in modern art and was teaching a course at Wellesley, just outside of Boston, on modern art. And they asked him to help them create this institution that would reflect the vitality, the energy of a place like New York, which was certainly at the beginning of the 20th century, all about the future. So the foundational idea of the museum was to be about the present and the future. And to do that, they needed to build a collection. And it was a disruptive idea because the prevailing interest at the turn of the 20th century in modern art was really Meissonier, who you see, well, to my upper left. That's what places like the Metropolitan Museum were collecting when they thought about collecting contemporary art. And that, of course, would have been a late 19th century painting. And while Meissonier today may not be a current name, at the beginning of the 20th century, he was understood to be one of the leading artists of the late 19th, early 20th century. But the founders of the Museum of Modern Art were interested in Cézanne and believed that there was a new audience who were interested in this new art that was radical and disruptive and different. And so they needed to create an institution that would be radical and disruptive, that would, in a sense, go against the grain of the time. And on the lower right, you see the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which was typical of an American museum at the turn of the 20th century, situated often in a park, up a flight of steps, borrowing the language of neoclassical architecture to make it a kind of temple of the muses that was removed from the street because it was lofty and serene. So the founders of the Museum of Modern Art, which began in 1929 but took until 1936 before they created their first purpose-built building, borrowed the language of international architecture, and they created a museum that was on the street. that was immediate and engaged with the city, that didn't set itself apart, but rather said the art we're interested in, the experience we want to create, is an experience that is linked to the energy of the urban environment. And they announced themselves not with a big sign on the street, but they announced themselves on the roof of the museum, because they were part of this vertical city. So they thought about a new kind of art to be seen in a new kind of architecture to engage the city in a new kind of way. And they thought about creating a collection that would have a kind of horizontality to it. So prevailing museums, and even museums today in many instances, collect by geographic area, and they collect across history. Early medieval art, Renaissance art, Baroque art. Museum of Modern Art collects by medium. It makes no distinction of temporality, and it makes no distinction of geographic boundary. But what it collects are paintings and sculptures, prints, drawings, photography, film, and now video and architecture and design. So by looking across media, it set out a new model about how to see these works of art that it thought were so important. And in doing so, it wanted to create a collection that, in the words of the founder of the Museum of Modern Art, Alfred Barr, founding director, would be like a torpedo moving through time, that the nose of that torpedo would be the ever-advancing future, and the tail would be the ever-receding past. And the idea was that the frame of reference would be about 50 years, which was seen to be about 2 generations. So you needed the earlier material in order to provide a historical context for the most recent and most challenging art. Of course, what happened over time is that the nose of that torpedo kept advancing, but we put a bungee cord on the tail because we never wanted to really let go of all those great early works of art that we had collected. But you have to understand the museum as a place that is continuously evolving. Barr's words was metabolic, or ever self-renewing. So the collection began with works of art like Van Gogh's Starry Night, and set out to trace broadly a history of modern art. Continues from post-impressionism to the foundational works of the cubists like Picasso and the Demoiselles d'Avignon of 1907 that literally created a new kind of art, fractured the picture plane, talked about nonlinear perspective. Matisse, that gave art a new kind of emotional charge. I've always loved this painting. It's called The Piano Lesson, and it depicts Matisse's young son learning to play the piano with his mother, this stern figure in the background, and the metronome in the foreground, and you can just hear the tick-tock of that metronome inscribed on that triangle of the young child's face, and then paralleled by that triangle of green that opens up the vista, and you can feel the pressure on this child as he tries to learn to play the piano. De Kooning, and of course you have a beautiful de Kooning upstairs here that opens up the whole language of abstract expressionism. Or Jackson Pollock, here you see our great painting, number one of 1951. And we're so grateful to you here for having lent blue poles to our Pollock exhibition over, I guess now almost 15 years ago. And one doesn't need to repeat it, but I'm going to anyway. It is one of the great paintings you have here. It's an icon. It's singularly important. And I think it takes an enormous amount of courage to acquire a painting of that kind of importance. And it's so impressive that it was done here against the grain. And that's what great works of art do. They create not just aesthetic and artistic experiences, but they also create social and political experiences that go way beyond their immediate shape and frame. And Blue Poles is one of those resonant works of art. And when we saw it in New York, in the context of all of Pollock's work, it stood out. It had a power and a vibrancy that made clear that it's as great as any other of Pollock's greatest works of art. So you should be very proud of that work, among the many other things you have. And of course, out of abstract expressionism came artists like Jasper Johns that looked at the language of abstract expressionism but tried to return to it of figurative quality, or Andy Warhol with his great gold Marilyn that borrows the language of the icon to celebrate popular culture, or Gerhard Richter's meditation. This is October 18th, 1977, which is a meditation on the Baader-Meinhof group, a group of terrorists that were ultimately captured, and the leaders of that group committed suicide the same day in prison and left this ambiguous question of were they murdered or was it suicide? Or, of course, the great sculptural works of Richard Serra. Now, what I've just traced for you very quickly is a kind of linear history of some of the great moments of modern art. But it's also a history that has been critiqued as being largely the story of white males, European white males. And as we think about the issues we need to deal with, we're hyper aware that we have to expand that story, that there are many other vitally important practices that are currently taking place and that took place that we need to represent thoughtfully within the frame of our program. And that includes African American artists, and here David Hammonds with one of his great body prints. Women artists like Valley Export, a pioneer of conceptual art and minimalist art and performance in the 1960s in Vienna. Latin American artists like Elio Oiticica, who borrow the language of geometric abstraction, but manipulate it and twist it in new ways. Or Asian artists like Kudo, a Japanese artist of the 70s, whose work has a kind of contaminated quality, and you can imagine, poisoned almost, you can imagine what it must have been like to be Japanese in a post-Hiroshima world, and recognizing how everything ultimately is framed, at least in post-war Japan, by these tragic events. Oh, Ai Weiwei, great contemporary Chinese artist. I've always loved this sequence of taking this treasured object, holding it, dropping it, and shattering it. And I think that issue of shattering is also about liberation. It's about how do you create new possibilities for art. And you have to do it by breaking out of tradition. Or Huma Bibi, an artist from Pakistan now living in the United States. Or Rania Stefan, a brilliant Lebanese filmmaker whose work here is called The Three Disappearances of this famous Egyptian actress, and it's a history of this actress told through film clips of her work. And it's a work that meditates on the temporality of fame, but does so in a way that's universal. Or Robin Rhodes, a great young South African performance artist. All of these different traditions, and I could go on to name even more, somehow have to find a way into our collections to expand and enlarge the stories we tell. And that's the key point that I want to make, that what we do with our collections, whether we're here in the National Gallery in Canberra or at the Museum of Modern Art, is we organize these collections to tell stories, to articulate different readings or propositions for understanding culture and art. So what I want to talk about are some of the challenges that we as institutions face. And the first one is, how do we convert from the analog to the digital? What's involved with that? And I don't mean this simply from the technological point of view, and here's a map of the Museum of Modern Art's technological interests and what we're trying to do as we expand our digital frame. So we're obviously looking at how to create apps, phone apps, iPad apps, and everybody's trying to do this, doing online courses that can be accessed by people around the world, exhibitions that are presented online, social media that reaches out to new and different audiences and allows people to tap into the museum, live streaming of our events, e-books, and research projects. But the really interesting thing about the digital question is not how to do the technological stuff. That's the easy part. The hard part, and the more interesting part, it seems to me, is how do we convert from analog thinkers, and most of us have been brought up to think in an analog way. How do we convert to digital thinkers? And Joy Ito, who's the head of the MIT Media Lab, recently gave a lecture and showed me this slide, and it really speaks to what I'm trying to talk about. How do we privilege emergence over authority? And if you're a museum, you're a control freak. We're all about trying to ensure that there's a certain order to what we do. How do we let that go? How do we privilege learning over education? How do we privilege practice over theory? How do we train ourselves to seek risk over safety? That is, to become comfortable with making mistakes. How do we privilege pulling over pushing? Compasses over maps. I love that. How do we train ourselves to learn how to move rather than to looking at the map, which is already creating a defined movement? Systems over objects. All of these different ways of recognizing that the digital world operates differently, non-hierarchically, than the analog world in fixed institutions like museums that exist in time and space with real objects have to evolve ultimately into digitally thinking institutions. And it's the hardest task we have. But I thought I'd try and give you an example of how we're trying to do that. So, one of the landmark exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art that Alfred Barr, our founding director, did in 1936 was called Cubism and Abstract Art. And what he wanted to do was to map, and I show you the cover of his book that was this critically important mapping of Cubism by tracing all of the different ways in which Cubism came to be, its sources and its history. And this map, as you can see, has a linearity to it. It has little tiny arrows, if you can see those at the bottom. It's vectoral, it's directional. It is the ultimate expression of an analog hierarchy. And at the time, it was revolutionary because he was trying to create a way of thinking about Cubism as the result of these different traditions, as the end of a kind of thought process. Last year, we did a show called Inventing Abstraction that Leah Dickerman, a brilliant curator at the Museum of Modern Art, did. And what she did was to see the move to abstraction not as the result of a set of linear directional actions, but as a network. And she looked at the relationship of all of the different artists who ultimately practiced abstraction to each other. And what you see are the red, and it's impossible to read, I recognize that, but think of it as a field. What you see, the artists in red are connectors. Those are artists who had relationships with more than, I think it's 20 other artists. And the artists in white are the many different artists who were engaged with abstraction during the period from circa 1910 to sort of 1930 in and around Paris, Moscow, and elsewhere in Europe and North America. So this kind of thinking creates a very different model. Rather than a hierarchy, it creates a lateral way of imagining how art is made and practiced, and ultimately gave rise to an exhibition that could juxtapose the work of artists like Marsden Hartley, Duchamp, and Brancusi in the same breath, something that would have been impossible for Barr's exhibition to have done, because they would have been separated by their different moments in history and the different threads that led to each of their work. So, how to learn to think digitally today. That's one great challenge. A second challenge is how do we remain disruptive? So the foundational aspect of the Museum of Modern Art was to see a new kind of art, Cézanne instead of Meissonier, and to recognize that there was a new audience for that art, an audience that didn't want to go to historical museums, that didn't want to ascend a set of steps and separate itself from the street, but wanted to be engaged with the immediacy of the street. So how do we now, 80 years later, remain disruptive? And we thought about that a great deal in the late 1990s and realized that the way we could remain disruptive was to commit ourselves absolutely to contemporary practices. And you can imagine that over the years, as you've collected masterpieces like by Cézanne and Van Gogh and Picasso and Matisse, Pollock and Warhol, that there would have been a tendency to focus on those artists already well established. When in fact, our mission is to always be thinking about the artists who are not yet familiar and to be seeking them out and putting them in the context of the immediate past so that we can make our own judgments about whether or not they have something new and powerful to offer us. We realized that to do that on our own today, 80 years after our founding, would have been incredibly difficult. Somebody asked me, and I'll come back to it, somebody asked me at lunch, well, why didn't you just blow the museum up and start all over again? And the only way I could explain that was, well, if we had done that, it would be like trying to turn a huge ocean liner as quickly as you would a Ferrari. It would have been, we would have capsized. So what we decided to do was to merge with a small alternative arts organization called PS1, it's now called MoMA PS1, that had a really vibrant, energetic program that was all about emerging artists. And PS1, it's actually in a public school number one. That's what it was actually called before the school was decommissioned. In the 1970s, became this incredibly interesting place that engaged a whole generation of artists that actually the Museum of Modern Art wasn't paying that much attention to. It's really close to where we are. You can see it's just on the other side of the East River, 2 subway stops from the museum, so physically very proximate, but in another part of town that could be miles away. And PS1 had really 2 points of view. It looked at emerging artists, and here you see the work of Tobias Putri, and it looked at older artists forgotten, like Lee Lozano, that had fallen off the map. So that gave it its point of view, and we thought, okay, if we take the energy of PS1 and we merge it with the expertise of the Museum of Modern Art, we could re-energize our own programs while bringing a certain amount of financial stability to PS1, which was looking for a partner because it had realized it was going to be incredibly difficult to sustain its foundational energy over a long period of time. And so they were looking for ways to preserve what they had created at the very moment we were looking to find the kind of energy that PS1 represented. And of course, because it's in Queens, it has a lot of space, maybe not as much space as you have at this beautiful museum, but nonetheless for New York, an enormous amount of space, which allowed us to create new kinds of programs together. This is a work called Wendy that's actually part of an annual competition we do every summer called the Young Architects Project, where we invite emerging architectural firms to create a summer platform for a music festival that brings about 5,000 young people to the museum every Saturday afternoon. People who would not otherwise have anything to do. They don't have enough money, they don't have enough time to go to the beach. So we've created an urban beach for them that is fantastic, and it's all about, of course, experiencing new architecture that's being made for this very purpose, but also the museum in general. And for me, what is interesting is this kind of challenge. How do you, 80 years into your history, remain as vital as you were at your foundation? And there is a kind of energy that's always present in foundational moments that tends to flatten out over time. And the thought was, could we embed in ourselves a kind of perpetual sense of disruption that would always make us keenly aware that our mission was not only to present those iconic works of modern art, but also the defining works that were yet to have been made. and to be that place that created a conversation between the present and the future and the immediate past. So the other and third issue that I think is central to what we're trying to do, and perhaps important to any other museum, is how do you act in a global world? It's impossible today, especially if you're interested in modern and contemporary art, not to be everywhere. But to be everywhere is, in a way, mission impossible. There's no way that you can be in Sao Paulo, Rio, Shanghai, Beijing, Sydney, Canberra, Los Angeles, New York, Berlin, Paris, right? Every major city in every region of the world is producing really interesting art. So how do you work within that global environment and yet still have a program that makes sense? So it seems to me, three ways of doing that. The first is you need to do the research, and that is the foundational moment that we can create a research program. That's what we call CMAP, Contemporary and Modern Art Perspectives in a Global World. That's all about bringing curators, artists, critics from around the world into a conversation about contemporary and recent practices. And CMAP currently has 3 different working groups. One deals with Latin America, and particularly the emergence of abstraction in Latin America. Another deals with performance in Japan, especially post-war Japan. And a third deals with post-war Eastern Europe. And eventually we'll work on issues that deal with India and the Middle East and Lord knows where else. But the point is, rather than trying to build our own museum in one of these places or ignoring them, we thought we could actually create these conversations that take place not only at the museum, but also in the regions where we're working. And these research programs are not designed to produce a result. They're designed to learn and to share knowledge between our own staff and interesting individuals from those regions. And if they result in a publication or an exhibition or an acquisition, that's great. But they really are, first and foremost, about creating knowledge and understanding so that we can better act in New York. The second is to take the idea of this Young Architects Project and find partners that might be interested in doing something similar. And today, this project now has 4 partners in Santiago, Chile, in Rome, in Istanbul, and lower right, now in Seoul. And the idea is to find partners, museums or other partners that are committed to young architectural practices, that we each year share juries, select young architects to build something, and then we unite these 5 different locations on a website so that anyone can see what's happening with young emerging practices in Seoul or in Rome or in Chile or in Istanbul, which is what you see in the upper left. And this idea of partnerships, it seems to me, is essential if you want to work in a global environment. You need to do this with others. And that's part of the digital idea as well, that you don't do it on your own. You do it by connecting to like-minded entities that share similar issues and similar values. And a third way of doing this is to think about exhibitions that have a global perspective. And we're about to open a show called Uneven Growth that looks at the morphology of megacities. And the 6 megacities we picked were Hong Kong, Lagos, New York, Rio, Istanbul, and Mumbai. But the way we went about doing this exhibition was to say, okay, here are 6 really interesting megacities. And we created workshops in each of those cities that brought together urban planners, economists, architects, sociologists from those cities to think about the issues that were unique and germane to each of those cities. And then this fall, on November 19th, we'll bring the result of these workshops which are a series of analyses, drawings, models, and propositions together under one roof at the Museum of Modern Art, so that you can actually change the kinds of exhibitions you do if you think about them in a global context. Doesn't mean you should ever give up monographic shows on major artists, but it also means that can't be the only thing you do. And for us, we are first and foremost a museum located in a very particular place, New York City, Midtown Manhattan, but we have to be connected to all the other interesting places in the world. So we are constantly trying to negotiate the tension between the local and the global. And of course, it would be, I think, a disaster if all museums around the world showed the same works of art. Why would you ever travel to those museums if you could see the same thing at home? So difference is really important, and yet at the same time, connection has to be equally important. And trying to balance these two things out seems to me essential. And that leads to my sort of final point, which is the notion that all of these different threads, the idea of navigating in the global world, of thinking digitally, of remaining disruptive, ultimately lead to this notion of a participatory museum. And what do I mean by that? I mean, first and foremost, a museum that's open and transparent. And one of the things that many museums, I think, of the 20th century suffer from is that they tend to be closed boxes. They come in the door, and then you're inside the box, and you have no sense of being part of a larger environment. And when Yoshio Taniguchi remade the Museum of Modern Art, the first thing he did was to, in a sense, peel back those walls so that you could see into the museum, so that you were, whether you were on the street or in the museum, you were connected to the fabric of the world around you. And I think the very beautiful addition you have to your museum accomplishes something along that order. It opens up the museum in a way that perhaps the original museum might not have been. And as we think about how to take that idea of transparency and openness even further, we're working with Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, an architectural firm in New York, to open up our museum and literally do what we did to our north side, to our south side, but at the same time, we're building a new wing here, and we're also part of a major skyscraper that Jean Nouvel has designed next door to us. And in linking the existing museum to the little, what I call sliver building, to the giant skyscraper, what we're trying to do is open up those galleries, open up the passages through the museum, so that that sense of transparency is the defining sense you have when you're visiting the museum. And that will express itself in new galleries. This is a project gallery that will be for emerging artists, young artists. And the notion of this gallery is that it will be right on the street, absolutely the kind of thing that you walk down the street, you're not even thinking about going to a museum. Suddenly you look in, and there's art that is absolutely of the moment and exciting. And we're looking at ways to make that space actually free to the public. We charge admission. I don't know whether you charge admission here, but we're a private institution, so we require admissions as a means of supporting our activity. But we want to expand that opportunity to someone and everyone who might not even have the wherewithal to visit the museum. And we do have free hours on Friday afternoon, but the notion is to create a gallery that was available and accessible to all, or a studio space that would allow us to do performance, sound, video in a kind of ideal environment. So these are new kinds of galleries with new kinds of space that create new kinds of engagement for our audience. And of course, technology allows us to create connectivity, and by participatory, what I really mean is this sense that when we come to a museum, that social experience is what the glue that connects us not only to works of art, but to each other. So we created Audio Plus because it's not only providing digital information acoustically about what's going on at the museum, it's also allowing anyone who's using that, which is also downloadable as an app onto your own phone, to share what they're seeing or share what they're thinking with anyone else in the museum and anyone else they know. And it creates the possibility, they can take pictures and immediately post them on Instagram or Pinterest or any other form of social media that they want to use. And it creates the opportunity of shared experiences in or outside the museum. And this sense of sharing, it seems to me, is fundamental to what happens in a museum. I was asked earlier today about taking pictures in the galleries. Was I for it or against it? And I love it. And many people don't. But I think of the act of memorializing what you see as a means of locking into your mind something that's vital and important to you. It's literally what would be called in the 19th century a souvenir, a memory that you cherish. And we want a museum that is 24/7, where whether you're in the museum or thousands of miles away, you can share your thoughts about the art that you've seen or are thinking about with people that are equally interested in that. And of course, participatory also means engaging with works of art in new and different ways. So on the left is a Rodin, beautiful Rodin of Balzac, one of the great late 19th, early 20th century manifestations of powerful sculpture. But of course, if you think about it, that Rodin really belongs to a long tradition of sculpture that in its own way is kind of obdurate. What you do is you circumnavigate it, but you never engage it immediately and directly. On the right is a Richard Serra, one of the great sculptors certainly of the 20th century, maybe of all time. What Serra does is he blows the sculpture apart and makes it participatory, because in order to understand that sculpture, you have to enter it. And by entering it, you realize it has neither an exterior nor an interior, but it has both simultaneously, and you're always physically negotiating between its exterior and interior. You are, in a sense, connecting to that sculpture in a very different way than you might to Balzac. It takes nothing away from Balzac, but it suggests that this sense of participation is a very important direction that many artists themselves are exploring. And perhaps one of the most well-known examples at the Museum of Modern Art, a performance that Marina Abramovich did in 2010 called The Artist is Present. And I think Marina is going to be here in Australia, in Hobart and in Sydney later this year. And if you have the chance to see her do it, she's absolutely extraordinary. The Artist is Present was a retrospective that took place in one part of our galleries, but it was also a performance in our atrium. And all she did was to sit at a table, and eventually she took the table away, and she invited anyone who wanted to sit with her for as long or short a period of time as they wanted. And this is on the final day, and some 750,000 people came to do this. And what you have to understand is maybe 10 or 12 people got to sit with her a day. So over 77 days, probably 1,000 people sat with her. So the other 749,000 people came to be part of that experience. But what she understood was that the work of art was not her and wasn't you. It was her and you together, connecting, and that connection, which of course she catalyzed by her own personality, but she catalyzed also by the gift of creating a moment in which two human beings could relate to each other in new and different ways. That gift, that catalyzation, that connection was about the joint making of a work of art. And it was so powerful that people literally at times broke down in tears. Some people proposed marriage to her. You couldn't talk to her, but they proposed marriage to her via writing, by things. It became this extraordinary moment. But she understood that what made this work of art different and powerful was that it involved the audience in its own creation, and it was live streamed. So whether you were physically present or 10,000 miles away, you could participate in this project in a very visceral and immediate way. Or Roman Andak, a young artist whose work is called Measuring Your Universe. And what he proposed is that anyone who comes into the gallery could have their height ticked off on the wall and their initials and the date of their visit inscribed. And so taking that simple exercise that many of us went through as young children, when your parents scored your height on the wall and you went back a year later and, oh my goodness, I grew 2 inches. It was very immediate. What he understood was in this process, everybody who actually had their height inscribed was making the art. He wasn't making the art. He was the agent for the art being made, but you as a visitor were making the art. And you were being inscribed into the fabric of the institution. So the museum was no longer something distant. It was actually your own. And you could come back with your friends and say, oh, that's where I was, or that's where, you know, my friend was. He was literally creating a community of artists that were making the museum new and different. And of course, what happens over time is more and more heights and more names are inscribed, and you get this vortex that ultimately creates this extraordinarily powerful wall drawing. But everyone who participated in that made it. It wasn't Roman Andak alone. It was all of us who allowed ourselves to be part of that work of art. Now, I don't want to suggest that the Participatory Museum is only about large social experiences, like all of these people looking at or photographing the Demoiselle d'Avignon. The Participatory Museum is a museum that seeks to create conversations between individuals and everyone else at the museum, between individuals and works of art, between those works of art and other works of art, that recognizes that it's conversations that animate the experience of the museum, that it's about thinking about art in a larger social context that creates new possibilities, but it also recognizes that that unique solitary moment has its own power. So we're constantly oscillating between the social experience and the solitary experience. But these moments are few and precious, and they're more powerful for their very preciousness. And that in the social context of the museum, there's always the possibility of incredible events. This is a happening that Doug Aiken created for us with this soundboard that he played, and where literally 2,000 or 3,000 people showed up to be part of this one night. So that's one way of participating in the museum. That's one kind of activity. But ultimately, if the museum is successful, one single person, this young child, can jump for joy at Olafur Eliasson's ventilator. And that sense of engagement, of energy, participation, is what can transform the museum into something even more powerful than what it already is. And with that, I thank you for putting up with me, and I am so grateful for being here tonight.